In the shadows of Chicago's South Side, two brothers faced a world determined to write their story, but fate had other plans. From prison cells to Silicon Valley, their journey would shatter expectations, challenge a broken system, and redefine the American dream. This is a tale of redemption, innovation, and the power of second chances.
Growing up in the projects of South Chicago, my twin brother Marcus and I were inseparable. We shared everything: clothes, toys, and dreams of a better life. Our mama worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, and we rarely saw our daddy. He was in and out of jail, a victim of the system and his own bad choices. But mama, she was our rock, always telling us we could be anything we wanted if we worked hard enough. From the moment we started school, Marcus and I realized we were different. Not just because we were twins, but because of the color of our skin. We were often the only black kids in our classes, and the stares and whispers followed us everywhere. I remember the first time someone called us the N-word. We were just 6 years old, playing on the rusty swings in the park near our apartment complex. A group of older white boys rode by on their shiny bikes, laughing and pointing. One of them yelled out that hateful word, and even though we didn't fully understand its meaning then, we knew it was meant to hurt us. As we grew older, the discrimination became more apparent and more painful. Teachers would often mix us up, not bothering to learn which twin was which. When we'd correct them, they'd roll their eyes or make a joke about how we all look alike. It stung, but Mama taught us to hold our heads high and not let their ignorance define us. By the time we hit middle school, Marcus and I had developed different coping mechanisms. I buried myself in books, finding solace in stories of great black leaders and scientists who'd overcome adversity. Marcus, on the other hand, began to rebel. He'd talk back to teachers, skip classes, and hang out with the older kids from the neighborhood who always seemed to have money and nice things. One day, when we were 13, an incident at school changed everything. Our history teacher, Mr. E. Thompson, was discussing the Civil War. He glossed over the brutality of slavery, describing it as a necessary evil for the economic growth of the South. I couldn't believe my ears. My hand shot up, and I started rattling off facts I'd learned from my own reading about the horrors of slavery and its lasting impact on Black Americans. Mr. Thompson's face turned red with anger. "That's enough," he snapped. "You're disrupting the class with your biased version of history." The other students snickered, and I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation. But then Marcus stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "My brother's not biased, you are," he shouted. "You're trying to whitewash history and make slavery sound like it wasn't that bad. Well, it was bad, and its effects are still here today. Just look at how you're treating us right now." The class fell silent. "Mr. Thompson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Finally, he pointed to the door. "Both of you, principal's office, now." As we walked down the empty hallway, Marcus punched the lockers in frustration. "It's not fair," he muttered. "No matter how smart we are, no matter how hard we try, they'll always see us as less than them." I didn't know what to say. Part of me was proud of Marcus for standing up for us, but another part was scared. I knew that anger, no matter how justified, could be dangerous for young black men in America. The principal, a stern white woman named Mrs. Hartley, listened to our side of the story with a bored expression. She then called Mr. Thompson, who painted us as troublemakers who had disrupted his class with militant ideas. In the end, we both got detention for a week. When we told Mama what happened, she hugged us tight. "My brave boys," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of you for standing up for the truth, but you gotta be careful. This world ain't always kind to folks like us who speak up." That night, as Marcus and I lay in our shared bedroom, staring at the ceiling fan slowly spinning above us, I could feel a change in the air. Something had shifted between us, like a hairline crack in a mirror that you don't notice until it starts to spread. "Jay," Marcus whispered in the dark. "So you ever feel like no matter what we do, we'll never win?" I turned to look at him, his face barely visible in the dim light filtering through our threadbare curtains. Sometimes, I admitted. But then I think about all the people who fought and died so we could have a chance. We gotta keep trying for them. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Maybe, he said finally. But I'm tired of trying to fit into their world. Maybe it's time we make our own rules. I didn't know it then, but that night was the beginning of the fork in the road that would eventually lead us down very different paths. As we entered high school, the divide between Marcus and me grew wider. I threw myself into my studies, determined to get good grades and win scholarships. Marcus, true to his word, started making his own rules. He fell in with a group of older guys from the neighborhood, guys who always seemed to have the latest sneakers and phones despite not having jobs. I tried to talk to him about it, worried about the risks he was taking. Come on, bro, I'd say. You're smarter than this. You don't need to be running with those guys. But Marcus would just shake his head. You don't get it, Jay. Your way might work for you, but it's not for me. I'm tired of playing by their rules and still ending up at the bottom. It broke my heart to see him drifting away, but I didn't know how to bridge the growing gap between us. We were still brothers, still twins, but it felt like we were living in different worlds. One day during our junior year, I came home to find Mama sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. When she looked up, I saw tears in her eyes. "What's wrong, Mama?" I asked, my heart racing. She took a deep breath. "It's Marcus. He got arrested today. They're saying he was involved in a convenience store robbery." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Marcus, a robbery? It didn't seem possible. But then I thought about the new clothes he'd been wearing, the cash he always seemed to have despite not having a job. I felt sick to my stomach. "What's going to happen to him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mama shook her head. "I don't know, baby, but it ain't good. He's still a minor, but they're talking about trying him as an adult because of the gun involved." A gun. The word echoed in my head like a gunshot. How had things gone so wrong? How had my twin brother, my other half, ended up here? The next few months were a blur of courtrooms, lawyers, and visiting hours at the juvenile detention center. I'd sit across from Marcus, separated by a thick pane of glass, and barely recognize the angry, bitter young man on the other side. "You gotta fight this, Marcus," I'd plead. "You're better than this. You can still turn things around." But he'd just stare at me with cold eyes. "Easy for you to say, Mr. Perfect. You don't know what it's like out there in the real world." His words stung, but I refused to give up on him. I started bringing him books, the same ones that had inspired me. Biographies of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Barack Obama. At first, he ignored them, but as the weeks dragged on, I'd catch glimpses of dog-eared pages and underlined passages. Meanwhile, I doubled down on my studies. I was determined to succeed, not just for myself, but for Marcus too. I wanted to show him that there was another way, that we didn't have to be defined by our circumstances or the color of our skin. As senior year approached, I found myself at a crossroads. I had the grades to apply to top colleges, but the thought of leaving Mama and Marcus behind filled me with guilt. How could I go off to pursue my dreams while my twin brother sat in a cell? It was Mama who finally convinced me to apply. "You listen to me, Jaden," she said, using my full name like she always did when she was serious. "You've worked too hard to throw away this chance. Your success doesn't diminish Marcus's struggle. If anything, it gives him hope. Shows him what's possible." So I applied, pouring my heart into essays about overcoming adversity and the importance of education in breaking cycles of poverty and discrimination. And when the acceptance letters started rolling in, including one from a prestigious university with a full scholarship, I felt a mix of elation and heartbreak. The day before I left for college, I visited Marcus one last time. He looked tired, but there was a spark in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. "I'm proud of you, Jay," he said, his voice gruff. "You're gonna do great things." I pressed my hand against the glass, wishing I could hug him. "I'm gonna make it right, Marcus, I promise. I'm gonna become successful, and then I'll come back for you. We'll change things together." He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. I believe you, bro. Now go show them what a kid from the South Side can do. As I walked out of the detention center for the last time, I made a silent vow. I would succeed, not just for myself, but for Marcus, for Mama, and for all the other kids from neighborhoods like ours who were told they couldn't make it. I would prove them wrong, and then I'd come back and help others do the same. Little did I know then how that promise would shape the rest of my life, leading me down a path I could never have imagined. But that's a story for another time. As I stepped onto the sprawling university campus, I felt like I'd landed on another planet. The manicured lawns, towering buildings, and sea of unfamiliar faces were a far cry from the cracked sidewalks and familiar faces of my neighborhood. I clutched my second-hand backpack tighter, feeling the weight of my family's hopes and dreams on my shoulders. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of orientation sessions, class schedules, and trying to navigate this new world. I'd never seen so many white faces in one place before, and the stark contrast to my life back home was jarring. In my dorm, I was the only black student on the entire floor. My roommate, a white guy named Brad from Connecticut, looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and unease when we first met. "So, where are you from?" he asked, his eyes darting around our shared room. "South side of Chicago," I replied, bracing myself for the reaction I'd come to expect. Brad's eyes widened. "Whoa, isn't that like super dangerous? How'd you end up here?" I bit back the urge to roll my eyes. Instead, I launched into an explanation about my scholarship and my dreams of becoming a software engineer. As I spoke, I could see Brad's perception of me shifting, his initial wariness giving way to genuine interest. That interaction set the tone for much of my college experience. I was constantly navigating between two worlds, the one I came from and the one I was trying to enter. In classes, I often found myself being the only black voice in discussions about race and social issues. It was exhausting, always feeling like I had to represent my entire race, to be the good black person who could educate my white peers. One day, in my American history class, we were discussing the civil rights movement. The professor, a middle-aged white man, was talking about the progress that had been made since the 1960s. A white student raised her hand and declared that racism was no longer a significant problem in America. I felt my blood boil. Before I could stop myself, I was on my feet, my voice shaking with emotion as I recounted my experiences growing up, the discrimination my family faced, and the stark realities of being black in America. I told them about Marcus, about how a single mistake had derailed his life in a way that likely wouldn't have happened to a white kid from a wealthy suburb. The classroom fell silent. Some students looked uncomfortable. Others seemed genuinely shocked. The professor, to his credit, thanked me for my perspective and used it as a launching point for a deeper discussion about systemic racism and privilege. After class, a group of students approached me. To my surprise, they weren't angry or defensive. Instead, they were eager to learn more, to understand. It was the first time I realized that my voice and my experiences had power, that I could use them to bridge the gap between worlds and maybe, just maybe, make a difference. As the semester progressed, I threw myself into my studies with a fervor that surprised even me. The workload was intense, and there were nights when I'd find myself hunched over my computer at 3 a.m., eyes burning from staring at lines of code. But every time I felt like giving up, I'd think of Marcus, of Mama, of the kids back in my neighborhood who never got this chance. Their faces would flash before my eyes, and I'd dig deeper, push harder. I also started to seek out other students of color on campus. We were few and far between, but we found strength in each other. We'd gather in the multicultural center, sharing stories of microaggressions we'd faced, strategies for dealing with imposter syndrome, and dreams of what we'd do once we made it. It was during one of these gatherings that I met Aisha, a brilliant computer science major whose parents had immigrated from Nigeria. She had a fire in her eyes that reminded me of Marcus, and a determination that matched my own. We bonded over late-night study sessions and discussions about how we could use technology to empower underserved communities. As my freshman year came to a close, I felt like I was finally finding my footing. My grades were excellent. I'd made friends who understood and supported me, and I even landed a summer internship at a tech startup in Chicago. The best part? It meant I could spend the summer close to home, close to Mama and Marcus. The day I returned home, Mama enveloped me in a hug so tight I could barely breathe. "Look at you," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "My college man." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mama." The next day, I visited Marcus. He looked different, older, more serious. But when he saw me, his face broke into the wide grin I remembered from our childhood. "Jay!" he exclaimed, pressing his hand against the glass that separated us. "Man, look at you. You look like one of them college boys on TV." I laughed, feeling a mix of joy and sadness. "How you holding up, bro?" Marcus's smile faded a bit. "It's rough, man, but I'm hanging in there. Been reading those books you sent. Got me thinking a lot." We talked for hours, about my experiences at college, about his life inside, about our dreams for the future. As I was leaving, Marcus called out to me. "Jay, wait, I'm proud of you, man. You're doing it. You're really doing it." I felt tears prick my eyes. "We're doing it, Marcus. I'm not leaving you behind. We're in this together, remember?" That summer was a turning point. By day, I worked at my internship, soaking up knowledge like a sponge and impressing my supervisors with my work ethic and innovative ideas. By night, I'd visit Marcus or help Mama around the house. I also started volunteering at a local community center, teaching basic coding skills to kids from the neighborhood. It was during one of these volunteer sessions that the idea hit me. What if I could create a platform that would make coding education accessible to kids in underserved communities? A way to bridge the digital divide and give kids like me and Marcus a fighting chance in the tech world? The idea consumed me. I spent every free moment sketching out plans, researching similar initiatives, and refining my concept. When I shared it with Aisha over a video call, her eyes lit up. "Jay, this is brilliant," she said. "You know, my cousin works for a nonprofit that does something similar in Nigeria. Maybe we could collaborate, make this a global initiative?" The possibilities seemed endless. For the first time, I felt like I could see a clear path forward, a way to succeed in the tech world while also giving back to my community. As the summer drew to a close and I prepared to return to college for my sophomore year, I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. I was eager to dive back into my studies and continue developing my project idea, but leaving home was harder than ever. The night before I left, Mama sat me down at our small kitchen table. She took my hands in hers, her eyes serious. "Jaden," she said, "I want you to listen to me. You're carrying a heavy load, baby. The weight of your dreams, your brother's struggles, our family's hopes. It's a lot for young shoulders to bear." I started to protest, but she held up a hand to stop me. "I'm not finished. You're strong, stronger than you know. But don't you ever forget that your success is yours. You don't owe it to me, to Marcus, to anyone but yourself. We love you and we're proud of you no matter what." Her words hit me like a tidal wave, releasing emotions I didn't even know I'd been holding back. I broke down then, sobbing in my mama's arms like I was a little boy again. She held me tight, her own tears mixing with mine. As I boarded the bus back to college the next day, I felt lighter somehow. Mama's words had given me permission to fully embrace my journey, to chase my dreams without guilt. I looked out the window as the familiar streets of my neighborhood faded into the distance, replaced by the promise of what lay ahead. I didn't know then how the next few years would unfold, how my idea would grow from a spark into a flame, or how the paths of Marcus and me would continue to diverge and intersect in ways I could never have imagined. But I knew one thing for certain. I was on my way, carrying the love and lessons of my family with me, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did I know that the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity for redemption was still to come. But that's a story for another time, a tale of success, failure, and the unexpected twists of fate that would bring me face to face with my past in the most surprising way. The next few years at college flew by in a whirlwind of classes, coding marathons, and late-night brainstorming sessions. My idea for the coding education platform, which I'd named CodeBridge, had evolved from a vague concept into a fully fledged project. Aisha and I, along with a small team of like-minded students, spent every spare moment working on it. But college wasn't all smooth sailing. The further I progressed in my studies, the more I felt the weight of being one of the few black students in the computer science program. There were days when the microaggressions and casual racism felt like death by 1,000 cuts. I'll never forget the day I walked into my advanced algorithms class and overheard a group of white students talking. One of them, a guy named Tyler who'd always been cold towards me, was loudly proclaiming, "I don't get why they lower the standards for diversity admits. It just makes the rest of us look bad." My hands clenched into fists, and I felt a familiar anger rising in my chest. But before I could say anything, another voice chimed in. "Dude, shut up. Jay's one of the top students in our class. If anything, he's making us look bad." I turned to see Chris, a quiet guy I'd worked with on a few projects, glaring at Tyler. The rest of the group shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with me as I took my seat. After class, Chris approached me. "Hey man, I'm sorry about Tyler. He's an idiot." I nodded, grateful for the support but too tired to get into it. "Thanks, Chris. It's not the first time I've heard stuff like that, and it probably won't be the last." Chris looked troubled. "That's messed up. I never realized, I knew racism was still a thing, but I didn't know it was this bad in our field." His words struck a chord. Here was someone who genuinely wanted to understand. So, I took a deep breath and started explaining. I told him about the constant pressure of feeling like I had to represent my entire race, about the assumptions people made about my intelligence or how I got into the program, about the exhaustion of always having to prove myself. As I spoke, I could see the realization dawning in Chris's eyes. "Man, I had no idea," he said when I finished. "Is there anything I can do to help?" His question caught me off guard. It was the first time a white classmate had ever asked me that. "Just be aware," I said. "Speak up when you see this stuff happening. And maybe, if you're up for it, we could use another coder on the CodeBridge project." Chris's face lit up. "Really? I'd love to help." From that day on, Chris became not just an ally, but a true friend. His presence on the team brought a new perspective to CodeBridge, and he often used his privilege to amplify our voices in spaces where we might have been overlooked. As graduation approached, CodeBridge was gaining traction. We'd run successful pilots in several Chicago schools, and the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Kids who'd never had access to coding education before were building their own apps and websites. It was incredible to see. But with success came new challenges. We needed funding to scale up, and navigating the world of venture capital as young, mostly black and brown founders was like entering a minefield. I'll never forget our first big pitch meeting. We'd managed to secure a meeting with a prominent VC firm in San Francisco. Aisha and I had spent weeks preparing, refining our pitch deck, and practicing our presentation until we could recite it in our sleep. As we walked into the sleek, modern office, I felt like an imposter. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly when she saw us, and I could feel the stares of the mostly white male employees as we were led to the conference room. The partners filed in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. As we launched into our pitch, I could feel the energy in the room shift. They were impressed by our traction, our passion, our vision. But then came the questions. "This is all very inspiring," one partner said, leaning back in his chair. "But how do you plan to monetize this? After all, these underprivileged communities aren't exactly a lucrative market." I felt a flash of anger at his casual dismissal of the communities we were trying to serve. But I kept my cool, explaining our tiered pricing model and how we plan to partner with schools and nonprofits. Another partner chimed in, "And what's to stop a bigger tech company from just copying your idea and doing it at scale?" Aisha fielded this one, her voice steady as she outlined our unique approach and the relationships we'd built in the communities we served. "We're not just a tech solution," she said. "We're a movement. Our users trust us because we come from their communities. We understand their needs in a way no big tech company ever could." The meeting ended on a positive note, with the partners promising to be in touch. As we left the building, Aisha and I exchanged a look. We'd done our best, but we both knew that our race and background would be a factor in their decision. A week later, we got the news. They were passing on our seed round. The rejection stung, but it only fueled our determination. We threw ourselves back into the work, refining our product, expanding our user base, and seeking out investors who shared our vision. It was during this time that I received news from home that shook me to my core. Marcus was up for parole. The thought of my brother finally being free filled me with a mix of joy and anxiety. What would life be like for him on the outside? How much had prison changed him? I flew back to Chicago for his parole hearing, my heart pounding as I entered the stark, fluorescent-lit room. Marcus was led in, looking older and wearier than I remembered. But when he saw me, his face broke into that familiar grin. The hearing was tense. The parole board grilled Marcus about his time in prison, his plans for the future, his support system on the outside. I spoke on his behalf, talking about our family's support and my plans to help him reintegrate into society. After what felt like hours, the board announced their decision. Marcus was granted parole. The relief that washed over me was indescribable. As we left the hearing room, I pulled Marcus into a tight hug, not caring about the disapproving looks from the guards. "We did it, bro," I whispered. "You're coming home." Marcus's eyes were wet as he pulled back. "I can't believe it," he said. "Jay, I don't know how to thank you for never giving up on me." I shook my head. "You never have to thank me. We're brothers. We're in this together, remember?" The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. I took time off from Codebridge to help Marcus settle in, finding him a job at a local community center and enrolling him in some basic coding classes. It wasn't easy. The world had changed a lot while Marcus was inside, and he struggled to adjust. There were nights when I'd wake up to find him sitting in the dark, staring out the window. "I don't know if I can do this, Jay," he confessed one night. "Everything's so different. I feel like I don't belong anywhere." I sat with him, listening as he poured out his fears and frustrations. "It's gonna take time," I told him. "But you're not alone. We're gonna figure this out together." As I watched Marcus slowly find his footing in this new world, I couldn't help but reflect on our divergent paths. Here I was, a college graduate with a promising startup, while my twin brother was struggling to rebuild his life after years in prison. The injustice of it all hit me anew, strengthening my resolve to make Codebridge a success. I knew that our story, of two brothers from the South Side, one who made it out and one who got caught in the system, was all too common. But I was determined to change that narrative, not just for us, but for all the other kids growing up in neighborhoods like ours. Little did I know that the biggest challenges and the most unexpected twists in our story were still to come. The road ahead would test our bond as brothers, challenge everything I thought I knew about success and failure, and ultimately lead to a reunion that would change our lives forever. But at that moment, standing with Marcus as he took his first steps towards a new life, I felt ready to face whatever came our way. The years that followed were a whirlwind of triumphs and setbacks. Codebridge grew from a small startup to a nationally recognized platform, changing the lives of thousands of underprivileged kids across the country. We finally secured major funding, and I found myself thrust into the spotlight as the face of a tech success story. Magazine covers, TV interviews, TED Talks, suddenly I was everywhere. From the South Side to Silicon Valley, they called me. The narrative was compelling. The young black man who beat the odds, who was using his success to give back to his community. It was a story people wanted to hear, a feel-good tale of the American dream realized. But the reality was more complicated. Yes, Codebridge was successful beyond my wildest dreams. We were making a real difference, opening doors for kids who'd never even dreamed of a career in tech. But with success came scrutiny, and I found myself constantly walking a tightrope. In board meetings and investor pitches, I had to be the perfect CEO, confident, articulate, innovative, but never too aggressive, never too urban. I code-switched so much I sometimes forgot who I really was. And all the while, I carried the weight of my community's expectations on my shoulders. I wasn't just representing myself anymore. I was representing every black kid with a dream. Meanwhile, Marcus was struggling. Despite my best efforts to help him reintegrate, he found it hard to adjust to life on the outside. The entry-level job at the community center didn't last. He clashed with his supervisor, a middle-aged white woman who, in Marcus's words, treated him like he was stupid. The coding classes frustrated him. He felt too old, too far behind to ever catch up. One night, after yet another argument about his future, Marcus stormed out of my apartment. "You don't get it, Jay," he shouted. "Not everyone can be like you. Some of us are just stuck." His words haunted me. Had I become so caught up in my own success that I'd lost touch with the reality of where we came from? Was I pushing Marcus too hard, trying to mold him into a version of myself? As CodeBridge continued to grow, I found myself traveling more and more. New York, San Francisco, London. My life became a blur of airports and hotel rooms. Each time I came back to Chicago, the gap between my world and the one I'd grown up in seemed to widen. It was during one of these trips, at a tech conference in San Francisco, that I met Elena. She was brilliant, beautiful, and came from a world so different from mine it might as well have been another planet. The daughter of a Silicon Valley tech mogul, Elena had grown up with every advantage I'd lacked. Our whirlwind romance was splashed across the tech blogs and gossip columns. Tech's power couple, they called us. For a while, I let myself get caught up in it all. The glamour, the parties, the sense of finally belonging in this world I'd fought so hard to enter. But reality came crashing down one sunny afternoon in Elena's family's Napa Valley vineyard. We were having lunch with her parents, and the conversation turned to politics. Elena's father, 3 glasses of wine in, started ranting about thugs and welfare queens. I sat there, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth, as Elena and her mother laughed uncomfortably. They didn't agree with him, but they didn't challenge him either. And in that moment, I realized how far I'd strayed from who I really was. I ended things with Elena soon after, much to the disappointment of our PR teams. The breakup was splashed across the same gossip columns that had celebrated our union, but I felt lighter, more like myself than I had in months. Returning to Chicago, I threw myself back into the work that really mattered. I spent more time in the communities we served, teaching coding classes myself and mentoring young entrepreneurs. It was during one of these classes that I met Shanice, a bright-eyed 16-year-old with a passion for AI and a drive that reminded me of myself at that age. Shanice had built a rudimentary AI program to help her younger brother, who had autism, communicate better. Her project blew me away, not just with its technical sophistication, but with the empathy and real-world problem-solving at its core. "This is amazing, Shanice," I told her after class. "Have you thought about turning this into a real product?" She looked down, suddenly shy. "I mean, I've thought about it, but I wouldn't even know where to start. People like me don't start tech companies." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. How many other brilliant kids were out there, holding themselves back because they didn't see people like themselves in the tech world? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Shanice, about Marcus, about all the kids in neighborhoods like ours who had so much potential but so few opportunities. And I realized that while CodeBridge was doing good work, it wasn't enough. We needed to do more. The next morning, I called an emergency board meeting. My proposal was radical. We would pivot CodeBridge from just an education platform to a full-fledged tech incubator for underserved communities. We'd provide not just coding education, but mentorship, seed funding, and connections to the tech world. The board was skeptical. It was risky, they argued. We'd be spreading ourselves too thin. But I was adamant. This was why I'd started CodeBridge in the first place, not just to teach kids to code, but to truly change the face of the tech industry. After hours of debate, the board finally agreed to a pilot program. We'd start small, with just a handful of young entrepreneurs from Chicago's South and West Sides. Shanice was our first recruit. Her AI communication tool became our first incubator project. We paired her with mentors, helped her refine her business plan, and connected her with potential investors. As word of our new initiative spread, Applications started pouring in. Young people with brilliant ideas and burning passion who'd never thought they'd have a shot at the tech world. We expanded faster than we'd anticipated, opening incubators in Detroit, Baltimore, Oakland. It wasn't all smooth sailing. We had our share of failures and setbacks. Some projects didn't pan out, some young entrepreneurs weren't ready for the pressure. But for every failure, we had a dozen successes. Kids from the toughest neighborhoods were building apps, launching startups, changing their communities from within. Through it all, Marcus remained a constant worry in the back of my mind. We'd grown distant over the years, our conversations becoming shorter and more strained. He'd bounced from job to job, never quite finding his footing. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I was in my office reviewing applications for our latest incubator cohort when my assistant buzzed me. "Mr. Johnson, there's a Marcus here to see you. He says he's your brother." My heart skipped a beat. Marcus and I hadn't spoken in months. What could have brought him here? I told my assistant to send him in, and a moment later, the door opened. Marcus walked in, looking older and more worn than I remembered. But there was something else too, a spark in his eye that I hadn't seen in years. "Jay," he said, his voice gruff, "I need your help." He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to me. As I unfolded it, I realized it was a business plan, rough and unpolished, but with a kernel of brilliance at its core. Marcus had come up with an idea for a ride-sharing app specifically designed for ex-cons and others with criminal records who often struggled to find employment. The app would provide background-checked, reliable transportation for people who might otherwise be denied service. "I know it's not much," Marcus said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "And I know I'm probably the last person who should be starting a business. But I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I really believe it could help people like me." I stared at the paper in my hands, then back at my brother. In that moment, all the years of distance and misunderstanding between us seemed to melt away. Here was Marcus, taking a chance, putting himself out there in a way he never had before. "Marcus," I said, my voice thick with emotion, This is incredible." And just like that, everything clicked into place. This was why I'd started CodeBridge, why I'd pushed for the incubator program. It wasn't just about creating more black and brown faces in tech. It was about giving people like Marcus, people who'd been written off by society, a second chance. That afternoon marked a new chapter in our lives. Marcus became the first participant in a new branch of our incubator program, specifically designed for formerly incarcerated entrepreneurs. His ride-sharing app, which we eventually named Second Chance Rides, became a runaway success, expanding to cities across the country. Working together on the app, Marcus and I rebuilt our relationship. We weren't just brothers anymore, we were partners, each bringing our unique experiences and skills to the table. As I watched Marcus pitch his company to a room full of investors, confident and articulate in a way I'd never seen him before, I felt a sense of completion. We'd come full circle, from two kids dreaming of a better life on the South Side to two men working to make those dreams a reality for others. The journey wasn't over, of course. There would always be new challenges, new mountains to climb. But standing there, watching my brother shine, I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together. We were living proof that with the right opportunities and support, anyone could rewrite their story. And we were determined to keep opening doors for others, one line of code, one startup, one second chance at a time. As the years rolled by, CodeBridge and Second Chance Rides continued to grow and evolve. Marcus and I found ourselves at the helm of a movement that was changing lives across the country. Our story, of two brothers from the South Side who'd taken such different paths only to reunite in a shared mission, became a symbol of hope and redemption. But success brought its own set of challenges. As our profile rose, so did the scrutiny. Critics questioned our motives, accusing us of exploiting our background for profit. Conservative pundits railed against the idea of giving criminals a second chance. We faced lawsuits, threats, and constant media pressure. Through it all, Marcus and I stood firm. We knew the truth of what we were doing, the lives we were changing, but the pressure took its toll. There were nights when I'd lie awake, wondering if we were really making a difference or just fooling ourselves. One particularly rough day, after a heated board meeting where we'd faced pushback on expanding our ex-offender program, I found myself driving aimlessly through the streets of our old neighborhood. Without really thinking about it, I ended up at the community center where it had all started, where I'd first taught coding classes to kids from the neighborhood. As I sat in my car, staring at the faded brick building, a tap on my window startled me. I looked up to see a face I hadn't seen in years. Mr. Thompson, my old history teacher. The same one who'd sent Marcus and me to the principal's office all those years ago for challenging his whitewashed version of history. My first instinct was to drive away, but something made me roll down the window instead. Mr. Thompson's face was lined with age now, his hair more gray than black, but his eyes widened in recognition as he peered into the car. "Jaden," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and something else I couldn't quite place. "Jaden Johnson?" I nodded, bracing myself for, I wasn't sure what, but what came next caught me completely off guard. "I owe you an apology," Mr. Thompson said, his voice heavy with regret. "I've been following your work, yours and your brother's, what you're doing. It's incredible, and it made me realize how wrong I was back then, how much damage I might have done with my ignorance." I sat there, stunned. This was the last thing I'd expected when I'd driven into the old neighborhood. As Mr. Thompson continued to speak, telling me how he'd changed his curriculum, how he now used CodeBridge as an example in his classes, I felt a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying start to lift. That chance encounter with Mr. Thompson sparked something in me. It reminded me why we'd started this journey in the first place, not for the accolades or the money, but to create real, lasting change. Energized, I called Marcus that night and shared my experience. As we talked, a new idea began to take shape. What if we could create a program that brought together law enforcement, educators, and former offenders? A way to bridge the gaps in understanding that led to so much of the systemic racism we were fighting against. Marcus was quiet for a long moment after I finished speaking. Then, his voice thick with emotion, he said, "Jay, that's it. That's the missing piece." We threw ourselves into developing this new initiative with renewed passion. We called it Bridge the Gap, and it quickly became our most ambitious and controversial project yet. The program paired police officers with former offenders and at-risk youth for coding boot camps and entrepreneurship workshops. The idea was to create a space where both sides could see each other as human beings, breaking down stereotypes and building understanding. Getting it off the ground wasn't easy. We faced resistance from all sides. Police unions wary of working with ex-cons, community leaders skeptical of collaborating with law enforcement, investors concerned about the potential backlash. But we persevered. We started small, with a pilot program in Chicago. The first few sessions were tense, with participants from both sides eyeing each other warily across the room. But as they worked together on coding projects and business plans, something remarkable began to happen. I'll never forget the moment I walked into one of our workshops and saw a young man with tattoos up his arms excitedly explaining his app idea to a police officer who was nodding along, offering suggestions. Or the time a veteran cop admitted, tears in his eyes, that the program had completely changed how he saw the community he patrolled. As word of the program's success spread, requests to expand started pouring in from cities across the country. We were making real, tangible progress in breaking down the barriers that had divided communities for generations. But with higher profile came greater risks. One evening, as Marcus and I were leaving a community meeting in Baltimore where we'd been discussing plans to launch Bridge the Gap, a car pulled up alongside us. I heard the sound of breaking glass, felt a sharp pain in my shoulder, and then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed, groggy and disoriented. Marcus was there, his face drawn with worry. As I slowly came to, he filled me in on what had happened. We'd been shot at by a group opposed to our work. I'd been hit in the shoulder, but Marcus had escaped unscathed. The attack made national news. Suddenly, we were at the center of the very debate about violence and systemic racism that we'd been working to address. As I recovered, we were inundated with messages of support from across the country, but also with increased threats and opposition. For a moment, lying in that hospital bed, I considered giving up. Was it worth risking our lives for? But then the letters started coming in, from kids in our coding classes, from ex-offenders who'd turned their lives around through our programs, from police officers whose perspectives had been changed. And I knew we couldn't stop. The day I was released from the hospital, Marcus and I held a press conference. Standing side by side, my arm in a sling, we reaffirmed our commitment to our work. We won't be intimidated, I told the sea of cameras. We won't back down. Because this work is too important, the stakes are too high. In the weeks and months that followed, something unexpected happened. The attack, rather than derailing our efforts, had brought national attention to our cause. Politicians who'd previously kept their distance were now calling for meetings. Major tech companies, eager to be on the right side of history, reached out about partnerships. We used this newfound platform to push for systemic changes. We advocated for reforms in the criminal justice system, for increased funding for education in underserved communities, for diversity initiatives in the tech industry, and slowly but surely, we began to see real change happening. 5 years after the shooting, Marcus and I stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., flanked by a bipartisan group of lawmakers. We were there to witness the signing of the Second Chance in Tech Act, a piece of legislation we'd helped craft that provided funding and support for tech education and entrepreneurship programs in underserved communities and for formerly incarcerated individuals. As I watched the president sign the bill into law, I couldn't help but think back to where our journey had started. 2 kids from the South Side, one who'd made it out and one who'd gotten caught in the system. Now here we were, changing the system itself. After the ceremony, Marcus and I took a walk around the National Mall. As we stood in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, Marcus turned to me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You know," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "there were times when I was in prison when I thought my life was over, that I'd never amount to anything. I never could have imagined this." I put my hand on his shoulder, feeling a lump form in my throat. "We did this together, bro. All of it." As we stood there, taking in the magnitude of what we'd accomplished, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Shanice, the girl whose AI project had inspired our incubator program all those years ago. She was writing to let us know that her company had just been valued at $1 billion, making her one of the youngest black female tech billionaires in history. I showed the email to Marcus, and we both broke into wide grins. This was why we'd done it all, to open doors, to create opportunities, to show kids like us that they could dream big and make those dreams a reality. As we walked back to our hotel, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road hadn't been easy. We'd faced opposition, violence, and countless setbacks. But we'd persevered, and in doing so, we'd changed not just our own lives, but the lives of thousands of others. Our journey wasn't over, of course. There was still so much work to be done, so many more lives to touch. But as I looked at Marcus, saw the strength and determination in his eyes that mirrored my own, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. We were no longer just 2 kids from the South Side with a dream. We were living proof that with perseverance, compassion, and a commitment to justice, anyone could rewrite their story. And in doing so, help rewrite the story of their community, their country, and maybe even the world. As we reached our hotel, a group of young coders from our latest Bridge the Gap program was waiting for us in the lobby. Their eyes shone with admiration and hope as they rushed to greet us, eager to share their latest projects and ideas. Looking at their bright, enthusiastic faces, I was struck by a powerful realization. Our story, mine and Marcus's, was no longer just about us. It had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of second chances and the transformative potential of technology. And in that moment, I knew that our greatest legacy wouldn't be the companies we'd built or the laws we'd helped pass. It would be the countless stories yet to be written, the dreams yet to be realized by all those we'd inspired along the way. As Marcus and I settled in to listen to the young coders' pitches, I felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over me. Our journey had taken us from the streets of South Chicago to the halls of power in Washington, D.C. But in many ways, we were just getting started. The future stretched out before us, full of challenges and opportunities, and I couldn't wait to see where it would lead us next. As the years rolled on, Marcus and I found ourselves at the forefront of a technological revolution that was reshaping not just the tech industry, but society as a whole. Our work with CodeBridge and Second Chance Rides had evolved into something far beyond what we'd initially imagined. We were no longer just teaching coding or providing transportation. We were fundamentally changing the way people thought about technology, opportunity, and second chances. One crisp autumn morning, as I sat in my office overlooking the Chicago skyline, my assistant buzzed me with an unexpected call. It was from the White House. The president wanted to meet with us to discuss a new initiative on tech education and criminal justice reform. As I hung up the phone, still in disbelief, Marcus burst into my office, his eyes wide with excitement. He'd just received the same call. The next week found us in the Oval Office, sitting across from the most powerful person in the world. The president leaned forward, her eyes intense as she outlined her vision for a nationwide program based on our work. She wanted to implement CodeBridge and bridge the gap in every major city in the country with federal funding and support. As we left the White House that day, Marcus and I exchanged a look of amazement. We'd come so far from those two kids on the South Side, dreaming of a better life. Now we were shaping national policy, influencing the future of millions of Americans. But with great power comes great responsibility, and we soon found ourselves facing challenges we'd never anticipated. As our influence grew, so did the opposition. Conservative pundits accused us of coddling criminals. Tech giants, threatened by our success, tried to undermine our programs. We even faced a congressional inquiry, accused of misusing federal funds, a charge that was later proven baseless, but not before causing significant stress and scrutiny. Through it all, Marcus and I leaned on each other. We'd been through too much, overcome too many obstacles to let these new challenges defeat us. If anything, the opposition only strengthened our resolve. It was during this tumultuous time that we received news that would change everything once again. Mama, our rock, our constant source of support and inspiration, was diagnosed with advanced stage cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months to a year. Suddenly, all our success, all our accolades, seemed hollow. We scaled back our public appearances, delegating more responsibilities to our trusted team, and focused on spending time with Mama. We moved her into a comfortable apartment near the best cancer treatment center in Chicago, making sure she had everything she needed. As Mama's condition worsened, she called Marcus and me to her bedside one evening. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were as sharp and loving as ever. She told us how proud she was of us, not just for our success, but for how we'd use that success to help others. She made us promise to continue our work, to keep opening doors for those who'd been left behind. Mama passed away peacefully in her sleep a few weeks later. The loss hit us hard, leaving a void that no amount of success could fill. For a while, I lost my drive, questioning the point of it all. Marcus, too, struggled, falling into a depression that worried me deeply. It was during this dark time that an unexpected letter arrived. It was from a young man named Jamal, who'd been through our Bridge the Gap program in Baltimore. Jamal had been a gang member, in and out of juvenile detention since he was 13. Our program had been his last chance to turn his life around. In his letter, Jamal told us how he'd just graduated from college with a degree in computer science. He was starting a job at a major tech company, and he'd recently bought his mom a house, the first in their family to own property. He wrote about how our program had not just taught him to code, but had shown him a world of possibilities he'd never known existed. Jamal's letter was a stark reminder of why we'd started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about the accolades or the influence. It was about changing lives, one person at a time. It was about fulfilling the promise we'd made to Mama. Reinvigorated, Marcus and I threw ourselves back into our work with renewed passion. We launched a new initiative called Mama's Promise, a scholarship program for kids from underserved communities who showed promise in STEM fields. The program didn't just provide financial support, but also mentorship, internships, and guaranteed job placement upon graduation. As Mama's Promise one took off, we started to see a shift in the tech industry. Companies that had once been skeptical of hiring our graduates were now competing for them. The diversity these young people brought to the table wasn't just good optics, it was driving innovation, creating products and solutions that served a wider range of users. 5 years after Mama's passing, Marcus and I stood on stage at the grand opening of the Johnson Center for Technology and Social Justice. It was a state-of-the-art facility in the heart of our old neighborhood on the south side, a gleaming beacon of hope and opportunity. The center housed a coding academy, a startup incubator, and a research institute focused on using technology to address social issues. But perhaps most importantly, it had a community center open to all, where kids from the neighborhood could come to learn, explore, and dream. As I looked out at the crowd gathered for the opening ceremony, I was struck by the diversity. There were kids from the neighborhood, wide-eyed with excitement. Former gang members turned entrepreneurs, police officers who'd been through our Bridge the Gap program, tech executives, and community leaders. It was a living embodiment of the change we'd been working towards all these years. After the ceremony, as Marcus and I were walking through the center, a young girl approached us. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with bright eyes and a shy smile. She told us that she wanted to be like us when she grew up. Not rich or famous, but someone who used technology to help people. Her words hit me like a thunderbolt. This was our true legacy. Not the buildings or the programs or the policy changes, but the dreams we'd inspired, the possibilities we'd opened up for kids like her. That night, Marcus and I sat on the roof of the center, looking out over the neighborhood where our journey had begun. The streets that had once seemed so limiting, so full of danger and despair, now pulsed with potential. "You know," Marcus said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I used to think that going to prison was the worst thing that could have happened to me. But now I'm not so sure. If I hadn't gone through that, would we be here now? Would we have understood the importance of second chances?" I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Our journey hadn't been easy. We'd faced discrimination, violence, loss. We'd made mistakes, had our share of failures. But each challenge had shaped us, had fueled our determination to create change. As the sun set over Chicago, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I felt a profound sense of peace. We'd come full circle, returning to where it all began, but with the power to reshape the future of this community and countless others like it. Our work wasn't done, of course. There would always be new challenges, new injustices to fight. But looking at Marcus, seeing the same fire in his eyes that I felt in my heart, I knew we were ready for whatever came next. We were no longer just two kids from the South Side, dreaming of a better life. We were living proof that with determination, compassion, and the right opportunities, anyone could rewrite their story. And in doing so, we were helping to rewrite the story of our community, our city, our country. As night fell and the center's lights flickered on, illuminating the streets below, I thought about all the lives that would be changed within these walls, all the dreams that would take flight, all the barriers that would be broken. I thought about Mama, and how proud she would be. I thought about Mr. Thompson, and how even those who seem set in their ways can change. I thought about Jamal, and all the other young people who'd found their path through our programs. And I realized that all of this, was just the beginning. The seeds we'd planted were growing, spreading, taking root in communities across the country. The revolution we'd started in technology and social justice was only gathering steam. As Marcus and I made our way back down to the bustling center, ready to inspire and be inspired by the next generation of innovators and change-makers, I felt a surge of excitement for the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles we might face, I knew that together, not just Marcus and me, but all of us who believed in the power of technology to create positive change, we were ready to meet them head-on. Our story, I realized, was no longer just about two brothers from the South Side who beat the odds. It was about the countless stories yet to be written, the lives yet to be transformed. And as we stepped back into the center, greeted by the excited chatter of young coders and the hum of computers, I knew that the most exciting chapters of our journey were still to come.